Blood drips from massive jaws as 4 silverback gorillas circle their fallen enemy. The ancient lion, scarred and breathless, lies motionless in the African dust. Steam rises from his wounds in the scorching heat. Ranger Kalin's hands tremble as he approaches the scene that defied every law of nature he'd ever learned. This wasn't supposed to happen. Predators don't save other predators. Gorillas don't risk their lives for lions. Yet here, in the heart of the Congolese wilderness, 4 giants had just rewritten the rules of survival itself. The largest silverback turns toward Kalin, his amber eyes reflecting something impossible. Recognition, understanding, perhaps even approval. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the gorillas vanish into the emerald shadows of the rainforest, leaving behind only the echo of their triumphant roars and a mystery that would haunt Kalin for the rest of his career. But how did we get here? How did 4 mountain gorillas end up in a life-or-death battle against a 20-foot African rock python to save a lion they'd never met? To understand this extraordinary moment, we need to go back to where it all began, 3 days earlier, when an old king made his final mistake. Before we dive into this incredible true story, I need you to do something for me. Drop your country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story of courage travels around the world. And if you're ready for more untold stories of survival and sacrifice from the wild, hit that subscribe button for Wind Echo Untold. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why some stories demand to be shared. 3 days before the confrontation that would shake the foundations of animal behavior research, Mfalme was dying alone. The name means king in Swahili, and for 12 years it fit him perfectly. Mfalme had been the undisputed ruler of the Kasai Pride, a magnificent coalition of 17 lions that dominated nearly 200 square miles of African savanna. His mane, once a flowing crown of gold and amber, had been his signature, visible from over a mile away, a warning to rivals and a beacon of security for his family. But kingdoms fall, and kings grow old. At 15, Mfalme's reflexes had slowed. His roar, once capable of freezing zebras in terror from 3 miles away, now came out as a raspy growl. The younger males in his pride had begun to circle like vultures, sensing weakness, waiting for their moment. It came during the dry season, when water was scarce and tempers ran hot. The challenge was brutal and swift. 3 young lions, brothers in their prime, attacked simultaneously. They didn't want to share power. They wanted to claim it entirely. The battle lasted only minutes, but it decided everything. Mfalme, bleeding from deep gashes across his shoulders and flanks, was driven from the only home he'd ever known. Behind him, the roars of his former subjects accepting new leadership echoed across the plains. Now, 72 hours later, Mfalme wandered the borderlands between 2 territories, unwelcome in both. His stomach empty for days, cramped with hunger. His wounds, untended, attracted flies and infection. Every step was agony, but stopping meant dying. And despite everything, the old king wasn't ready to surrender. He'd made it to the edge of the Congolese rainforest, a place where lions rarely ventured. The thick canopy blocked out the sun he'd lived under his entire life. Strange sounds echoed from the shadows, the calls of birds he'd never heard, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant crash of falling trees. This wasn't his world, but it might be his only chance at survival. What Mfalme didn't know was that he'd entered a realm ruled by different kings entirely, creatures whose intelligence and social bonds were about to change. Everything he thought he knew about survival. Nyoka had been waiting in the canopy for 6 hours. The African rock python stretched nearly 22 feet from head to tail and weighed over 200 pounds. She was ancient by python standards, perhaps 30 years old, and her reputation in this part of the forest was legendary. Local researchers had nicknamed her the Strangler of Giants after finding the remains of her victims, a young buffalo, several large antelope, and once, memorably, a leopard that had thought itself the apex predator. Python hunting required infinite patience, and Nyoka had perfected the art. She'd positioned herself along a game trail that wound through the forest's edge, where the trees began to thin and desperate animals came searching for easier prey. The thick branch she'd chosen could support her full weight, while keeping her completely motionless for hours at a time. When Mfalme stumbled into view, Nyoka's black eyes fixed on him with laser focus. The lion was perfect, large enough to feed her for months, but weakened enough to make the kill manageable. She could see the infection in his wounds, smell the fever that clouded his judgment. This wasn't a proud savannah king anymore. This was prey. Mfalme, delirious from hunger and pain, had caught the scent of water nearby. A small stream trickled through the forest floor just ahead, and his parched throat drove him forward. Despite the warning signals, his instincts were screaming. The forest felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. He lowered his massive head to drink, and in that moment of vulnerability, Nyoka struck. 22 feet of muscle and fury dropped from the canopy like a living avalanche. Mfalme's warrior reflexes, dulled by exhaustion, still managed one desperate twist that saved his life. Instead of landing across his neck, Nyoka's coils wrapped around his torso and hindquarters. But that only delayed the inevitable. The constriction began immediately. Each time Mfalme exhaled, Nyoka tightened her grip. Each breath became shallower than the last. The old lion's eyes bulged as he felt his ribs beginning to compress. He tried to roar, but only managed a strangled wheeze. The death spiral had begun, and in the dense forest where his roar couldn't carry, no one would hear his final moments. Or so it seemed. 400 yards away, concealed in the heavy undergrowth, Ranger Kalen Mwamba lowered his binoculars with shaking hands. In 15 years of wildlife monitoring, he'd witnessed countless predator kills. Circle of life, natural selection, survival of the fittest. These weren't just concepts to him, they were the fundamental laws that governed his work. But this felt different. This felt wrong. Maybe it was because Mfalme so clearly didn't belong here, driven to this alien environment by desperation rather than choice. Maybe it was the obvious suffering written across the lion's face, the way his golden eyes still held traces of the pride and nobility that had once made him king. Or maybe it was something else entirely. A premonition that what was about to unfold would change everything Kalen thought he knew about the natural world. Through his binoculars, Kalen watched Mfalme's struggles grow weaker. The python's coils tightened with mechanical precision. Death was perhaps minutes away, and then through the forest undergrowth came the sound that would haunt Kalen's dreams for years to come, the deep, resonant call of a silverback gorilla. But not just one call. 4 distinct voices, each deeper and more powerful than the last, echoing through the trees like war drums. Something was coming. Something that had no business being interested in a lion's death. Something that was about to rewrite the rules of nature itself. The first silverback to spot the struggle was Django, the scout of his troop. At 28 years old and 400 pounds of solid muscle, Django had spent his entire adult life patrolling the borders of their territory, watching for threats, evaluating dangers. His keen eyes missed nothing, and what he saw through the undergrowth made him freeze mid-step. A lion, unmistakably a lion, despite being miles from where any lion should be, writhing in the deadly embrace of the forest's most feared predator. Django had seen Nyoka hunt before. He'd watched her claim baboons who'd wandered too far from their troops, seen her digest the remains of forest buffalo for weeks at a time. The python was a fact of life in their world, a force of nature to be respected and avoided. But this was different. This creature trapped in her coils wasn't from their world. Django's low rumble brought the other 3 silverbacks running. Tembo, the eldest at 35, moved with the careful authority of age and experience. Gessi, the strongest, despite being only 24, bounded through the underbrush with barely contained energy. And finally, Jabari, the leader, the decision-maker, the one whose judgment the others trusted with their lives. At 29, Jabari had led their troop through drought, disease, and territorial wars with neighboring guerrilla families. His intelligence was legendary among the researchers who'd studied him. Dr. Sarah Chen had spent 3 years documenting his problem-solving abilities, his tool use, his capacity for what could only be described as strategic thinking. But nothing in her research had prepared her for what Jabari was considering now. The 4 silverbacks positioned themselves in a semicircle, perhaps 20 yards from where Nyoka continued her deadly work. They watched in perfect silence as Mafalma's breathing became more labored, as his struggles grew weaker. The lion's golden eyes, wide with terror and confusion, swept across the forest until they locked onto the gorillas. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, predator and protector stared at each other across the vast divide of species, territory, and natural order. Mfalm's expression was beyond desperation now. It was pure, vulnerable appeal. Not the command of a king, but the plea of a dying creature who somehow understood that these forest giants were his only hope. Jabari's massive chest rose and fell as he processed what he was seeing. Every instinct, every lesson learned through millions of years of evolution, told him to walk away. Lions were dangerous. Lions killed things like him given the chance. Lions had no place in his forest, and what happened to them was not his concern. But there was something else competing with those instincts, something that researchers were just beginning to understand about mountain gorillas. They possessed what scientists called theory of mind, the ability to understand that other creatures had thoughts, feelings, and experiences separate from their own. They could recognize suffering, even in species completely unlike themselves. Tembo, the eldest, began the traditional withdrawal behavior. He turned his massive back on the scene and started moving deeper into the forest, clearly expecting the others to follow. This was the way of their kind: observe, assess, avoid unnecessary risk. The forest had its own balance, its own laws, and they were not meant to interfere. Kesi, the youngest and most aggressive, was torn between his natural territorial instincts and something he couldn't quite understand. His knuckles dug deep furrows in the forest floor as he paced back and forth, powerful muscles coiled with indecision. Every few seconds he would take a step toward the struggle, then catch himself and step back. Django, the observer, simply watched. His role had always been to gather information and report back, not to make decisions. But even he could see that this moment was unlike anything in their collective memory. And Jabari was remembering. 6 months earlier, researchers had documented an extraordinary event. A young gorilla from their troop, barely 3 years old, had fallen into a fast-flowing river during the rainy season. The current had swept him downstream, beyond the reach of his panicking mother. Without hesitation, Jabari had plunged into the dangerous waters, fought against the current, and pulled the infant to safety. But that had been family. That had been a member of his own troop, his own responsibility. This was something else entirely. Mfalma's breathing was becoming critical. The python's coils had compressed his chest to the point where each breath was a monumental effort. Foam flecked the corners of his mouth, and his golden eyes were beginning to glaze over. Perhaps 30 seconds remained before unconsciousness, and then death would follow quickly. It was Django who made the first move. Though it wasn't the move anyone expected, the scout gorilla began to vocalize, not the aggressive hoots and screams that marked territorial disputes, but something else entirely, a low, rhythmic sound that researchers had only documented in a few specific circumstances. It was the sound gorillas made when trying to calm a distressed member of their troop, when attempting to communicate across the barriers of fear and pain. Mfalme's eyes, cloudy with approaching death, seemed to focus on the sound. His struggles, which had become increasingly frantic and ineffective, slowed into something more controlled. Not surrender, not yet, but a kind of recognition that he was no longer alone. The vocalization had another effect entirely. It made Jabari's decision for him. The massive silverback rose to his full height, nearly 6 feet when upright, and beat his chest with the thunderous rhythm that had intimidated countless challengers over the years. But this wasn't a threat display directed at the gorilla's traditional enemies. This was something new, a declaration of intent that rang through the forest like a war cry. Tembo, who had been retreating, stopped mid-stride. In all his years following Jabari's leadership, he'd never heard that particular combination of sounds. There was authority in it, yes, but also something that sounded remarkably like compassion. Jabari began to move toward the python and her victim, and the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. What happened next defied every textbook on animal behavior ever written. Jabari approached Nyoka with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who understood exactly how dangerous she was. African rock pythons weren't just constrictors. They were equipped with razor-sharp teeth designed to prevent escape, and their striking speed could catch even the quickest prey off guard. The silverback stopped just outside her strike range and began a complex series of vocalizations and gestures. De Ranger Carlin, watching through his binoculars with mounting disbelief. It looked almost like negotiation, as if Jabari was trying to communicate with the python, trying to find a solution that didn't require violence. For nearly a full minute, the strange standoff continued. Nyoka's black eyes fixed on this new threat, her coils maintaining their deadly pressure on Mafalme while her head weaved back and forth in the classic pre-strike pattern. The lion's breathing had become so shallow it was barely visible. Then Jabari did something that made Kalen's blood run. Cold, the silverback reached out with one massive hand and gently touched one of Nyoka's coils. The python's response was instantaneous and explosive. 22 feet of enraged serpent uncoiled from Mafalme like a spring, launching itself at Jabari with open jaws and bared fangs. The silverback barely had time to throw himself backward before those crushing coils were wrapping around his torso. But Jabari had achieved his objective. Mfalme, suddenly freed from the constricting pressure, gasped in a huge breath of air and rolled away from the struggle that was now focused entirely on his would-be rescuer. The sound that erupted from the other three silverbacks was unlike anything Kalen had ever heard. It wasn't just anger. It was pure, primal fury at seeing their leader under attack. The brotherhood that had kept their troop alive through countless dangers kicked in with devastating effect. Kessie reached them first, his youth and aggression making him the fastest responder. He grabbed Nyoka's tail end and began pulling with all his considerable strength, trying to stretch her out and break her grip on Jabari. The python, now caught between two powerful opponents, began to realize she'd made a critical error in judgment. Tembo and Jengo arrived seconds later, surrounding the struggle from opposite sides. 400 pounds each of gorilla muscle and intelligence, working in perfect coordination despite never having faced anything like this before. They didn't attack randomly. Each gorilla seemed to understand his role instinctively. Tembo grabbed the section of python wrapped around Jabari's chest and began systematically prying each coil loose. His experience and patience were crucial. A panicked attack might have caused Nyoka to constrict even tighter, potentially crushing their leader. Jengo focused on the python's head, staying just out of strike range, but close enough to distract her from maintaining her grip. His constant movement and vocalizations forced Nyoka to divide her attention between multiple threats, and Kessie simply held onto her tail with grim determination. His powerful hands locked around her body like steel vices. Every time the python tried to redirect her attack toward one of the other gorillas, she found herself anchored in place by the youngest silverback's incredible grip strength. The battle lasted less than 3 minutes, but those minutes contained enough violence and drama to fill an entire nature documentary. Nyoka, despite her size and power, was simply overmatched. Evolution had equipped her to handle individual prey animals, not coordinated group attacks by some of the most intelligent creatures in the animal kingdom. The moment she released Jabari to focus on the threats at her head and tail, the fight was effectively over. The silverback rolled free and immediately rejoined the attack. grabbing Nyoka's midsection and adding his strength to his troopmates' efforts. Nearly 800 pounds of gorilla muscle, all working together, finally convinced the python that this meal wasn't worth her life. Nyoka released her grip entirely and began the desperate process of trying to escape. But escape from 4 enraged silverbacks was easier said than done. They pursued her for nearly 50 yards through the underbrush, their triumphant roars echoing through the forest as the ancient predator fled in obvious terror. When they finally let her go, it was Jabari's decision. The leader called off the chase with a series of sharp vocalizations, and the other 3 obeyed immediately. They'd made their point. The threat had been eliminated. Now it was time to see if their unprecedented intervention had been worth the risk. Mufalme lay where he'd collapsed after breaking free from the python's coils. His breathing was labored but steady, and the color was slowly returning to his golden eyes. The compression injuries would heal, given time and rest. More importantly, the spark of life that had been fading just minutes earlier was burning bright again. The 4 silverbacks approached him carefully, their aggression completely gone now that the threat had passed. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary interspecies interaction ever witnessed in the wild. Jabari, still bleeding from shallow puncture wounds where Nyoka's teeth had found their mark, knelt beside the fallen lion. For nearly a full minute, the 2 apex predators simply looked at each other. There was no fear in either set of eyes, just recognition, understanding, and something that could only be described as mutual respect. The silverback reached out slowly and gently touched Mufalme's mane, the same gesture he might use to comfort a distressed member of his own troop. The lion didn't flinch or show any sign of aggression. Instead, he lifted his massive head and rubbed against Jabari's hand, the way a house cat might seek affection from its owner. But this wasn't ownership. This wasn't domestication. This was something far more profound, the recognition that intelligence, courage, and compassion could bridge the gap between any species. No matter how different their evolutionary paths, the moment was broken by a sound that made all 5 animals look up in alarm. Footsteps, human footsteps, approaching through the underbrush with careful deliberation. Ranger Kalin had made his decision. The decision to break protocol didn't come easily to Kalin Mwamba. For 15 years, he'd operated under the strict guidelines that governed wildlife research and conservation. Rule number 1 was sacred: never interfere with natural processes. Predation, competition, territorial disputes, all of it was part of the complex ecosystem that had evolved over millions of years. Human intervention, no matter how well-intentioned, could have unpredictable consequences that rippled through the entire food web. But what he'd just witnessed shattered every assumption he'd ever held about the natural order. 4 gorillas had risked their lives to save a lion, not just any lion, but a species that represented everything their kind should instinctively fear and avoid. They displayed tactical coordination, emotional intelligence, and what could only be called moral courage. And now, as Kalin watched through his binoculars, they were showing the same compassionate behavior toward their former enemy that they might show to an injured member of their own troop. If the animals could break the rules of nature, maybe it was time for him to break the rules of his profession. Kalin moved through the forest with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent decades observing animals in their natural habitat. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled. He knew that his next few minutes would determine whether this extraordinary rescue ended in triumph or tragedy. The 4 silverbacks heard him coming long before he came into view. Their posture shifted immediately from relaxed compassion to high alert, their massive bodies positioning themselves protectively around the injured lion. Jabari rose to his full height and beat his chest, once a clear warning that they considered Mufalme to be under their protection now. But something remarkable happened as Kalin stepped into the small clearing where the drama had unfolded. Instead of the aggressive charge he'd expected, Jabari tilted his head and studied the human with obvious curiosity. The silverback's intelligence was legendary among researchers, and it seemed he was trying to puzzle out this new development. Kalin stopped 20 feet away and began the ritualized greeting behavior that gorilla researchers had perfected over decades of study. He averted his eyes, made himself appear smaller and less threatening, and waited for permission to approach. What followed was a conversation conducted entirely in body language and intuition. Jabari looked from Kalin to Mafalme and back again, his expression thoughtful. The other three silverbacks remained tense, but ready to follow their leader's guidance. And Mafalme, despite his injuries and exhaustion, managed to lift his head and study this new arrival. The lion had spent his entire life learning to read the intentions of other creatures. Prey animals betrayed their fear through 100 tiny signals. Rival predators advertised their aggression through posture and movement. But what he sensed from this human was something else entirely: purpose, determination, and what felt remarkably like the same protective instinct the gorillas had shown. Slowly, carefully, Kalin reached into his backpack and withdrew his emergency first aid kit. He held it up where all 5 animals could see it, then set it on the ground and backed away. The message was clear: I'm here to help. What happened next would later be described by animal behaviorists as the most extraordinary example of interspecies cooperation ever documented. Jabari approached the first aid kit and examined it with the same methodical attention he might give to a new type of fruit or an unfamiliar tool. His powerful fingers explored the latches and zippers with surprising delicacy. When he looked back at Kalin, the ranger took it as permission to continue. Moving with glacial slowness, Kalin approached Mafalme while the 4 silverbacks watched his every move. The lion's injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. Deep lacerations from the python's teeth, severe bruising from the constriction, and signs of dehydration and malnutrition from his days of wandering. All of it was treatable, given proper care. As Kalin began cleaning the wounds with antiseptic, something extraordinary occurred. Django, the scout who had first spotted the python attack, moved to Mafalme's head and began the same gentle grooming behavior he would use to comfort a distressed gorilla. The lion, seemingly understanding that these massive creatures were trying to help, submitted to the treatment with remarkable trust. Tembo positioned himself as a lookout, his experienced eyes scanning the forest for any new threats. Kessie and Jabari flanked Kalin as he worked, close enough to intervene if needed, but careful not to interfere with the medical treatment. It was, Kalin realized, exactly what a gorilla family would do if one of their own had been injured. They were extending that same protective behavior to a creature who, by all logic and evolutionary programming, should have been their enemy. With Mafalme's wounds cleaned and bandaged, Kalin faced his next critical decision. The lion needed veterinary care that could only be provided at the Regional Wildlife Rehabilitation Center nearly 60 miles away. That meant calling for a helicopter, evacuation, and explaining to his supervisors why he'd abandoned protocol to intervene in a natural predation event. The conversation with his district commander was brief and tense. You did what, Kalin? Sir, I need immediate medical evacuation for an injured lion. Grid coordinates follow? A lion? We're in gorilla territory, Ranger. Lions don't... Sir, with respect, this situation is unprecedented. I'll file a complete report. But right now, I need that helicopter. There was a long pause before the commander's voice crackled back through the radio. This better be one hell of a story, Mwamba. ETA 40 minutes. As Kalin waited for the evacuation team, he found himself part of the most unusual vigil of his career. The 4 silverbacks had arranged themselves in a protective circle around Mafalme, with Kalin accepted as an honorary member of their temporary alliance. When the lion stirred restlessly, Django would gentle him with soft vocalizations. When shadows in the forest suggested possible threats, Kessie would rise to his full intimidating height and scan the perimeter. And Jabari never took his intelligent eyes off Kalin, as if he was trying to understand not just what the human was doing, but why. The silverback's expression reminded Kalin of the look children got when they were puzzling out some complex moral question. The same mixture of curiosity evaluation, and growing comprehension. The sound of rotor blades approaching through the forest canopy triggered an immediate response from the gorillas. Their protective formation tightened around Mafalme, and all four silverbacks began the low, rumbling vocalizations that preceded either flight or fight responses. But Jabari's reaction was different. The troop leader studied the approaching aircraft with the same analytical attention he'd given Kalin's first aid kit. When he looked back at the ranger, his expression seemed to be asking a question. Is this part of the help? Kalin's response was to remain calm and continue his gentle ministrations to Mafalme's wounds. The message was clear. The helicopter was not a threat, but another tool in the rescue effort. As the aircraft settled into the small clearing that the evacuation team had spotted from above, the guerrillas made their decision. One by one, they moved back into the forest undergrowth, giving the humans space to work while maintaining visual contact with their unlikely charge. The veterinary team that emerged from the helicopter had seen their share of unusual cases, but nothing had prepared them for this scene. A male lion, clearly suffering from python bite wounds, being treated by a ranger, while four silverback gorillas watched from the tree line like concerned family members. Dr. Amanda Foster, the lead veterinarian, later described it as the most emotionally complex rescue she'd ever participated in. The gorillas weren't hiding, she said. They were supervising. Every time we moved Mfalme or gave him an injection, they'd shift position to get a better view. It was like they were making sure we were taking proper care of him. Loading Mafalme into the helicopter required a delicate balance of speed and respect for his unusual guardians. The lion, heavily sedated but still conscious, seemed to understand that he was being taken somewhere safe. His golden eyes, clearer now than they'd been in days, swept across the forest edge where four massive silhouettes waited in the shadows. Just before the helicopter lifted off, Jabari stepped out of the underbrush. The massive silverback approached the aircraft until he was close enough to reach through the open door. For a moment that stretched toward eternity, gorilla and lion regarded each other one final time. Then, with infinite gentleness, Jabari reached out and touched Mafalme's mane, the same gesture of comfort and protection he'd offered during the python attack. The lion responded by lifting his great head and pressing it against the silverback's hand, a gesture of gratitude that transcended species, territory, and millions of years of evolutionary programming. As the helicopter rose above the forest canopy, Galen looked down to see all four gorillas standing in the clearing. Their faces turned skyward, watching their former enemy disappear into the distance. Their triumphant roars echoed across the wilderness, a sound of victory that had nothing to do with territory or dominance and everything to do with the simple, powerful act of choosing compassion over indifference. The Kasai Wildlife Rehabilitation Center had treated thousands of injured animals over its 20-year history, but Mfalme's arrival generated a buzz of excitement that rippled through the entire facility. Word of his rescue had spread through the conservation community like wildfire, and veterinarians, researchers, and wildlife enthusiasts were calling from around the world to follow his progress. Dr. Foster's initial examination revealed the full extent of his injuries and the remarkable fact that he was alive at all. The python's bite wounds were infected but responding well to antibiotic treatment. The compression injuries to his chest and abdomen were healing cleanly. More concerning was his overall condition: severe malnutrition, dehydration, and the psychological trauma of losing his pride and territory. He should have died out there, Dr. Foster confided to her colleague, Dr. James McAndawire, as they reviewed Mafalme's charts. Not just from the python attack, but from everything that led up to it. Lions don't survive long on their own, especially not at his age and in that condition. But he didn't die, Dr. McAndawire observed, studying the video footage that Kalin had captured of the rescue. 4 gorillas made sure of that. I've been studying animal behavior for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's going to change how we think about interspecies relationships. Mafalme's recovery was slow but steady. The physical wounds healed within weeks, but the deeper healing took much longer. Staff members at the rehabilitation center noted that he seemed to be listening for something. His head would lift and turn toward the forest whenever the wind carried sounds from the distant trees. Dr. Sarah Chen, the gorilla researcher who had spent years studying Jabari's troop, became a regular visitor during Mfalme's rehabilitation. She was fascinated by the psychological impact the rescue might have had on both the lion and his unlikely saviors. There's growing evidence that great apes experience empathy in ways we're only beginning to understand, she explained, to the documentary crew that had come to film Mfalme's recovery. But this goes beyond empathy. This was active intervention at significant personal risk. Jabari and his troop made a conscious decision to help a creature that evolution had programmed them to fear and avoid. The breakthrough in Mfalme's emotional recovery came 6 weeks after his rescue. Dr. Chen had brought recordings of gorilla vocalizations to play for him, hoping to trigger some positive memory response. When the audio reached Django's distinctive comfort calls, the same sounds the scout had made during the python attack, Mfalme's entire demeanor changed. The lion rose to his feet, his golden eyes suddenly bright and alert. He moved to the edge of his enclosure closest to the forest and began making soft, chuffing sounds that staff had never heard before. It was, Dr. Chen realized, his attempt to call back to the gorillas who had saved his life. Meanwhile, in the forest where the rescue had taken place, Jabari's troop was displaying behavioral changes that astounded the researchers monitoring them. The 4 silverbacks had begun making regular patrols of the area where they'd encountered Mfalme, as if checking for other creatures in distress. Even more remarkably, they'd started interacting peacefully with other species that ventured into their territory. A family of forest elephants that had previously been met with aggressive displays was now tolerated and even assisted when they encountered obstacles. A leopard with an injured paw had been observed resting near the gorilla troop's day nest, apparently benefiting from their protection while he healed. It's like they've developed a rescue complex, Dr. Chen reported to her research colleagues. The experience with Mfalme seems to have awakened something in them, a recognition that their strength and intelligence could be used to help rather than just intimidate. Django, in particular, had become the troop's designated medic. He was observed bringing healing leaves to injured members of the group, using tools to extract thorns, and even attempting to treat superficial wounds with the same gentle attention he'd shown Mfalme. After 3 months of rehabilitation, Mfalme had regained most of his physical strength and all of his mental acuity. The question now facing the conservation team was where to release him. Lions were territorial creatures who needed pride structure to thrive. At 15, he was too old to challenge for leadership of an established pride, but too proud to accept subordinate status. The solution came from an unexpected source, a message from the Kasai National Park authorities reporting unusual behavior from several lionesses in the southeastern sector. A small pride of 3 females and their cubs had been observed making regular visits to the forest edge, where Mfalme had been rescued. Game wardens reported that they seemed to be calling for something or someone. DNA. Analysis of hair samples collected from the area confirmed what everyone had begun to suspect. These were lionesses from Mfalme's original pride. Somehow, despite accepting new leadership, they had maintained their bond with their former king. The older females who had mated with Mfalme and raised his cubs were seeking him out. It's unprecedented, admitted Dr. Makandawire. Lion's social structure doesn't work this way. When a male is displaced, that's supposed to be the end of the relationship. But these females are actively searching for him. It's as if his survival against impossible odds and the story of his rescue has given him a mythical status. The decision was made to release Mfalme at the forest edge where his rescue had taken place, with the hope that he could reconnect with the lionesses who were seeking him. It was a calculated risk. There was no guarantee the reunion would be successful, and he might find himself once again alone and vulnerable in unfamiliar territory. The release took place at dawn, with a full team of veterinarians and researchers standing by to monitor the outcome. Mfalme emerged from his transport crate with the fluid grace that had once made him the undisputed king of the savannah. 3 months of rehabilitation had restored his physical condition, but more importantly, the spark of confidence in his golden eyes burned brighter than ever. He paused at the edge of the forest, his massive head turning toward the deep shadows where 4 gorillas had once risked everything to save his life. For nearly 5 minutes, he stood perfectly still, as if listening for familiar voices in the rustling leaves. Then, with a roar that echoed across the landscape like thunder, he announced his return to the world. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From 3 different directions came answering calls, the voices of lionesses who had been searching for their lost king for over 4 months. Mfalme's ears pricked forward, his entire body tensing with recognition and anticipation. What followed was captured on camera by the documentary crew and would later become one of the most viewed wildlife videos in history. 3 lionesses, Casey, named after one of his gorilla rescuers, Amara, and Django, another tribute, emerged from the tall grass and approached their former pride leader with cautious hope. The reunion was emotional beyond anything the research team had anticipated. Each lioness approached Mfalme individually, rubbing against him, nuzzling his mane, vocalizing with the low rumbles that indicated deep affection and relief. He responded to each greeting with the gentle attention of a patriarch welcoming back beloved family members. But the most remarkable moment came when 5 cubs, ranging in age from 6 months to 2 years, cautiously emerged from their hiding place in the grass. These were Mfalme's offspring, born before his exile, but now old enough to remember their father's scent and voice. Their joyful reunion, full of playful pouncing and protective nuzzling, brought tears to the eyes of even the most experienced wildlife researchers. Dr. Foster, watching through her binoculars as the reunited pride settled into their first communal rest in months, shook her head in amazement. "This isn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "Everything we know about lion behavior says this shouldn't be possible." But here we are, watching it unfold. In the weeks that followed Mfalme's release, the reconstituted pride established themselves in a unique territory that straddled the boundary between savanna and forest. It was an unusual choice that seemed to reflect their patriarch's extraordinary experience. Unlike traditional lion prides that avoided forested areas, Mfalme's family showed remarkable adaptability to both environments. The cubs, in particular, displayed behaviors that had never been documented in wild lions. They showed curiosity rather than fear when encountering forest creatures, and several were observed attempting to mimic the tool-use behaviors they witnessed in primates. One young male was even seen trying to use a stick to extract insects from a log, behavior that suggested the influence of their father's exposure to gorilla intelligence. Most remarkably, the pride's hunting strategies evolved to incorporate lessons learned from their forest neighbors. Instead of relying solely on individual strength and speed, they began displaying coordinated tactics that resembled the group cooperation Mfalme had witnessed during his rescue. Their success rate increased dramatically, and they quickly established themselves as a formidable presence in their new territory. 6 months after his release, Mfalme was thriving in ways that defied all predictions. His pride had grown to include 2 additional lionesses who had left their original groups to join his unconventional family. Cubs were healthy and developing unique behaviors that reflected their father's extraordinary journey. The pride controlled nearly 100 square miles of prime territory and had successfully defended it against several challenges from rival coalitions. But perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Mfalme's new life was his ongoing relationship with the gorillas who had saved him. Jabari's troop had established a routine of patrolling the forest edge where their territories overlapped with the lion pride's range. On several occasions, researchers documented peaceful encounters between the two groups, interactions that should have been impossible according to everything science understood. About apex predator relationships, Dr. Chen captured the most remarkable of these encounters on video during a routine observation session. Mfalme had been hunting near the forest edge when one of his cubs wandered too close to a concealed pit trap left by poachers. The young lion had fallen into the hole and was unable to climb out despite his mother's frantic attempts to help. Mfalme's roars of distress carried deep into the forest, and within minutes, a familiar figure emerged from the undergrowth. Jabari, now showing the grey around his muzzle that marked his advancing age, approached the trapped cub with the same deliberate care he'd shown during the python rescue. The silverback assessed the situation, then disappeared briefly into the forest. He returned carrying a long, sturdy branch, a tool selected specifically for the rescue operation. Working with remarkable precision, he used the branch to create a ramp that allowed the cub to scramble to safety. The reunion between the cub and his parents was joyful, but what happened next left Dr. Chen speechless. Mfalme approached Jabari and repeated the same gesture of gratitude he'd made in the helicopter, pressing his great head against the gorilla's hand in recognition and thanks. The silverback responded with the gentle, grooming behavior he'd shown months earlier, confirming that their bond transcended species, time, and circumstance. Word of Mfalme's rescue and its ongoing consequences spread throughout the global scientific community, challenging fundamental assumptions about animal behavior, intelligence, and interspecies relationships. Research papers were published in prestigious journals. Conferences were organized around the implications of the gorilla's actions, and entire university courses were restructured to incorporate the new understanding of animal empathy and cooperation. Dr. Jane Goodall herself traveled to the Kasai region to observe Jabari's troop and meet with the research team. Her assessment was both humble and profound. We are still learning how much we don't know about the emotional and intellectual lives of our fellow creatures. What happened here forces us to expand our definition of compassion, intelligence, and moral behavior. The rescue also had practical implications for conservation efforts. The area where Mfalme was saved became a protected research zone, with increased funding and security to ensure the safety of both the gorilla troops and the unique lion pride they had helped create. Tourism increased dramatically, bringing economic benefits to local communities and creating incentives for continued protection of the wildlife. Perhaps most importantly, the story inspired a new generation of researchers and conservationists who approached animal behavior with increased respect for the complexity and depth of non-human intelligence. Universities reported significant increases in applications for programs in animal cognition, interspecies communication, and conservation biology. As we reach the end of this extraordinary tale, I want you to think about what you've just witnessed. This isn't just a story about animals. It's a story about the fundamental nature of compassion itself. 4 gorillas looked at a dying lion, a creature they had every evolutionary reason to fear and avoid, and made a choice that redefined what we thought we knew about the natural world. They didn't calculate the risks or weigh the benefits. They simply saw suffering and decided to act. In that moment, Jabari, Django, Tembo, and Kessie demonstrated something that transcends species, territory, and millions of years of evolutionary programming. They showed us that empathy, real, active, self-sacrificing empathy, isn't a uniquely human trait. It's something deeper, something that connects all intelligent life on this planet. Think about Mfalme, the fallen king who found himself saved by the most unlikely heroes imaginable. His story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when we feel most alone and abandoned, help can come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes salvation arrives not from those who look like us or think like us, but from those who simply recognize our shared vulnerability and choose to care. And consider Ranger Kalin, who broke the sacred rules of his profession because he understood that some moments demand more than passive observation. His decision to intervene created the bridge between animal compassion and human action, proving that courage is contagious across all species. Today, nearly 2 years after that fateful encounter in the Congolese forest, Mfalme's pride continues to thrive in their unique territory. His cubs are growing into lions, unlike any seen before, creatures who display the hunting prowess of their species combined with the cooperative intelligence they learned. From their father's extraordinary journey, Jabari's troop has become the most studied gorilla family in Africa, their rescue behavior inspiring new research into animal cognition and empathy. They continue to patrol the forest edge, ready to help any creature in distress, proving that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. The legacy of that day extends far beyond individual animals. It has changed how we think about intelligence, compassion, and the interconnectedness of all life. It has shown us that the barriers between species are far more permeable than we ever imagined, and that the capacity for moral action exists throughout the animal kingdom. In a world that often seems divided by differences, whether of species, nationality, religion, or ideology, the story of Mfalme and his gorilla saviors offers a powerful reminder. Compassion is universal, courage is contagious. And sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply choose to help. These 4 silverbacks didn't save Mfalme because they expected anything in return. They saved him because it was the right thing to do. They remind us that heroism isn't about strength or power. It's about the willingness to act when action is needed, regardless of the cost. Before you go, I have a request that connects directly to what you've just witnessed. These stories of courage and compassion in the wild don't get told unless people like you choose to share them. Just like Jabari chose to help Mfalme, you can choose to help spread this message of hope and interconnectedness. Hit that subscribe button for Wind Echo Untold, because every subscription tells us that stories like this matter to you. In the comments below, tell us what you learned from Mfalme and Jabari's story. How did it change the way you think about compassion, courage, or the relationships between different species? And here's the most important part. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Maybe it's someone who's going through their own dark forest, feeling abandoned and afraid like Mfalme was. Maybe it's someone who has the power to help others, but isn't sure whether they should get involved. Or maybe it's someone who simply needs to be reminded that heroism exists in the most unexpected places. The research legacy that began with 4 gorillas and 1 lion continues with every person who watches this story and chooses to be a little more courageous, a little more compassionate, a little more willing to help when help is needed. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Until next time, remember, in a world full of ordinary moments, be the gorilla who chooses to be extraordinary.